Welcome to Cassandra Revenge Stories, where quiet women turn betrayal into reckoning.
My name is Vivian Pemberton. I'm 38 years old. On the fourth Thursday of November, in a dining room I'd known since childhood, I placed a notarized letter on the table between the cranberry sauce and the bread basket. My mother's wine glass stopped halfway to her lips. It stayed there for 11 seconds. I counted. I'd been counting things for 14 years. Pills, hours, dollars, lies. By then, counting was the only language I trusted. What I read aloud at that table took 41 seconds. It undid a woman's entire performance in less than a minute. But to understand how I got to that chair, holding that letter, breathing that steadily while my mother's face drained of color, you need to go back. You need to go back to the beginning, to the cottage, to the green notebook, to the day I pressed play on a voicemail that was never meant for my ears. Welcome back to this channel. If you're here, I think you already know what it feels like to carry something heavy while everyone else walks light. This is a space for the ones who showed up, who stayed, who did the work nobody wanted to see. If this story lands for you, and I think it might, consider subscribing, leave a comment below. I'd like to know you're there. Now let me take you back to where it started. To understand how I ended up at that Thanksgiving table, you have to go back 14 years, back to when I was 24 and had just been accepted to a fellowship at Johns Hopkins. Occupational therapy, pediatric neurology focus. It was everything I'd worked for since undergrad. The letter came on a Tuesday. I remember because my father called me that same Tuesday evening, his voice already carrying the slightest thickness I hadn't noticed before, and said he needed to talk to me about something his doctor found. ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. The neurologist gave us a timeline of 3 to 5 years, which turned out to be optimistic in one sense and cruel in another. My father lived 11 more years, which sounds like a gift until you understand what those years contained. The disease took everything from him in stages, like a tide pulling furniture off a porch one piece at a time. First his hands, then his legs, then his speech, then his ability to swallow without choking. I deferred the fellowship. Then I declined it. Then I stopped thinking about it because thinking about it felt like betrayal. How could I mourn a career when my father was mourning his body? We lived in Montclair, New Jersey. The family home is a 1920s colonial on Upper Mountain Avenue, white clapboard with black shutters, the kind of house that looks like stability from the outside. My mother had the main house. I moved into the guest cottage out back, a converted carriage house with one bedroom, a galley kitchen, and a view of the backyard where my father used to garden before his hands stopped obeying him. I moved in so I could be close, so I could hear the monitor at night, so I could be there for the transfers, the feeding, the suctioning, the endless medical appointments that consumed entire days. My mother was there in the beginning. For the first 2 years, she helped with scheduling, drove to some appointments, managed the insurance calls. But she had what she called her limits. She needed space to process. She started traveling, first weekends, then weeks, visiting her college friend in Savannah, a spa retreat in Scottsdale, a Mediterranean cruise that was supposed to be healing. By year 3, she was essentially a visitor in her own husband's illness. She'd come home, kiss his forehead, tell him he looked good, which was a lie he was too gracious to correct, and then disappear into her room or out the door. My sister Brooke is 4 years younger than me. She moved to Charlotte right after college, married Mitchell, built a real estate career. She called our father on Sundays for the first few years, then bi-weekly, then holidays. She sent flowers on his birthday. She came home for Christmas exactly 6 times in 14 years. She never changed a diaper. She never administered medication through a peg tube at 3 in the morning. She never cleaned vomit from a recliner or talked him through a panic attack when the BiPAP failed. I did all of it, every day, every night, every crisis. I worked part-time at a rehab clinic in Morristown to keep my license active and cover the expenses insurance wouldn't touch. And I kept a notebook, a green spiral notebook from Staples, the kind that costs $1.49. I tracked everything in it, every out-of-pocket expense, every medication copay, every adaptive equipment purchase, every modification to the cottage to make transfers easier. Over 14 years, that notebook filled with $67,000 in unreimbursed costs. $67,000 I never asked anyone to repay because I actually believed, that what I was doing was recognized, that it was seen, that when the time came, the family would acknowledge what I'd given. My father died on a Wednesday in December, 11 months before that Thanksgiving. The morning was gray. I was holding his hand. My mother was in the next room on the phone with someone. I later learned it was her financial advisor. Brooke was not there. She arrived 2 days later for the funeral arrangements, stayed 4 days, and flew back to Charlotte. The first 3 months after his death were fog. I grieved the way you grieve when you lose both a father and a purpose simultaneously. For 14 years, his care had structured every hour of my life. Without it, the days were shapeless. I stayed in the cottage. I watered the garden he couldn't tend. I sat in his recliner, moved to the cottage after we sold the hospital bed, and read the books he could no longer hold. I thought the worst was over. I was wrong. The worst hadn't started yet. The first anomaly was small. 3 weeks after the funeral, I called the pension benefits office. My father had been a civil engineer for the state of New Jersey for 31 years before his diagnosis. His pension included survivor benefits, a monthly disbursement that I understood would continue to his designated beneficiary, me. He'd told me, during one of his lucid periods in the final years, that he'd named me because I was the one who stayed. He said it clearly. I remember the shape of his mouth forming the words, the effort it cost him. The woman at the benefits office was polite in the way that people are polite when they're about to deliver bad news. She said the survivor beneficiary had been changed. The new designation was joint. My mother and my sister Brooke. The change was filed the week after his death. I asked her to repeat that. She did. I asked when, specifically. She gave me a date. It was 3 days after the funeral. 3 days after we stood at the graveside, and my mother gripped my hand and whispered, "He's at peace now, Vivi." I put the phone down on the kitchen counter and stared at the wall for a very long time. My body did something strange. My fingers went numb and my jaw locked, and my breathing became shallow and fast, like my lungs were trying to run somewhere my legs hadn't agreed to go. I told myself there was an explanation. Power of attorney documents executed during hospice. Confusion at the office. A bureaucratic error. I told myself my mother would never do this deliberately. I told myself this for almost 2 weeks. Then more cracks appeared. I was helping sort through some of my father's remaining documents. Tax returns, insurance policies, the careful organizational system he'd maintained before the disease took his fine motor control. In a file cabinet in the main house, I found statements from a TD bank account I'd never seen before. The account was in my mother's name, opened 4 years earlier. Opened, I calculated quickly, approximately when my father lost the ability to speak clearly enough to make phone calls on his own behalf. The opening documentation listed power of attorney. The deposits matched, to the dollar, the monthly pension disbursement amounts. 4 years of deposits. Over $200,000 funneled into an account I'd never known existed. My hand shook when I held those statements. Not trembling, shaking. The pages rattled audibly in the silence of my father's old study. I counted the deposits. 47 monthly deposits. $220,000 deposited while I was in the next room administering his medications, while I was tracking my own expenses in a green notebook, while I was spending my own savings to keep him comfortable because I believed because everyone let me believe that the pension was going where it was supposed to go. I put the statements back exactly where I found them. I took photographs with my phone first. Every page, every deposit line. Then I slid them back into the folder, back into the cabinet, back into the position they'd been in. My hands had stopped shaking by then. Something had shifted. The grief was still there, but it had moved. It had dropped lower into my chest, behind my ribs, and something colder had risen in its place. My body had known before my mind accepted it. For weeks I hadn't been sleeping well. My appetite had vanished. I'd been startling at sounds. I'd attributed all of it to grief, to the natural aftermath of losing someone you'd orbited for 14 years. But it wasn't grief doing that. It was my subconscious recognizing what my conscious mind refused to name, that I was being robbed, that I was being erased from my own family's financial architecture by the people I'd sacrificed everything to support. Brooke called me for the first time in 8 months, not to grieve, not to ask how I was doing in the cottage alone, not to share a memory of our father or acknowledge what I'd done for him. She called to ask when I was moving out. "Mom wants to list the property," she said, her voice carrying that particular Charlotte transplant breeziness she'd adopted. "She's thinking spring. So if you could start looking for a place after the new year, that would be great." She said it the way you'd ask a tenant to vacate. Not a sister. A tenant. I said something neutral. I don't remember what. Something about needing time. Something about the grief. I hung up and sat in my father's recliner and felt the cold thing behind my ribs solidify into something with edges. This is where the story shifts. This is where I stopped being the woman things happened to and became the woman who went looking. I drove to the benefits office in person. I brought my driver's license, my father's death certificate, and a notarized copy of the original beneficiary designation, which I'd found in his files, filed under Pension Original Docs in his meticulous handwriting. The original named me as sole survivor beneficiary. The document the office had on file named my mother and Brooke jointly. I asked when the change had been submitted. The clerk pulled it up and confirmed. 3 days after the funeral. I asked what documentation had accompanied it. She said a beneficiary change form, signed by the account holder. I asked her to look at the signature. She did. She paused. She said she couldn't comment on ongoing matters, but that I should know the pension office had received additional documentation from an attorney, documentation that had triggered an internal review. I didn't understand that last part then. I would later. My father had built a failsafe, and it had already fired. The investigation after that was systematic. I am an occupational therapist. My entire career is built on observation, documentation, and methodical assessment. I assess function. I identify deficits. I build treatment plans based on evidence. I applied every one of those skills to dismantling what my mother had built. The TD Bank account was the surface. Beneath it was the beneficiary forgery. Because that's what it was. A forgery. My father could not have signed that form 3 days after his funeral because my father had been dead for 3 days. Someone had signed his name. Someone had forged a beneficiary designation in the week after we buried him. And the pension office had accepted it because the signature was accompanied by documentation that appeared legitimate. Documentation prepared in advance, waiting for the moment it could be filed. That realization changed everything. This was not confusion. This was not grief-addled decision-making. This was premeditated. Someone had prepared a forged document while my father was still alive, or within days of his death, and filed it at the earliest possible moment. The precision of it made my stomach drop. I went to the bathroom and knelt on the tile floor and dry heaved for 5 minutes. Then I washed my face, dried my hands, and went back to the file cabinet. There was more. There was always more. I made an appointment with the family accountant, Gerald Byrne, who'd handled my parents' taxes for 20 years. I told him I was organizing my father's estate paperwork and needed to review what had been reported. Gerald was helpful until I asked about the caregiver salary. He looked confused. "The salary your mother reported paying you," he said, "for caregiving services. She's been deducting it for, let me check, about 4 years." I told him I had never received a salary, not $1. His face changed. He closed the file. He said he needed to consult with his own counsel before we discussed this further. A complete fabrication. My mother had told the accountant, told the IRS, that I'd been paid a caregiver salary for years. This served 2 purposes. It justified the money going to the TD Bank account as legitimate expense reimbursement, and it preemptively answered anyone who might ask why Vivian, the sole caregiver, wasn't receiving anything from the estate. She was already paid. She was already taken care of. The workhorse got her feed. Why would she need the inheritance too? I pulled my father's medical records next. I requested them from his primary care physician and from the hospice service. In the insurance documentation, someone had listed themselves as primary caregiver for the purposes of claiming a dependent care tax credit. My mother's name, my mother's social security number, a $1,400 monthly credit for providing care she never provided. Care I provided, every single day for over a decade. She claimed credit, literally, financially, tax credit, for work she watched me do from a distance while she was booking cruises and visiting friends. The green spiral notebook sat on my kitchen table during all of this. $67,000 of my own money, documented, dated, receipted. I'd never asked for reimbursement because I'd trusted that the family understood, that when the estate was settled, it would be acknowledged. Instead, my mother had built a financial architecture that not only excluded me, but actively fabricated a story in which I'd already been compensated. She'd created a paper trail for a salary I never received. She'd claimed tax credits for care she never gave. She'd forged a beneficiary change to redirect pension money away from me. And she'd done all of it while I was in the next room keeping her husband alive. This was not one lie. This was a system. Then Patrice found me at the grocery store. Patrice is my mother's book club friend, one of those women who wears scarves indoors and drinks white wine at noon and has strong opinions about novels she's only half read. She approached me in the produce section with the specific energy of someone who's been rehearsing a conversation in her car. "Vivian, honey," she said, I wanted you to know. Your mother told the book club that you have a spending problem, that you went through money your father left and now you're trying to get more from her." She looked at the floor. "I don't know what's true, but I thought you should hear what's being said." I thanked her. I put my hand on hers and thanked her. I went home and sat in the recliner and understood something new. My mother wasn't just stealing money. She was stealing my reputation. She was building a narrative. Vivian the spender, Vivian the taker, Vivian the ungrateful daughter who got free housing and a salary and still wanted more, so that when the truth eventually surfaced, no one would believe me. She was poisoning the well before I ever tried to drink from it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the dark and replayed 14 years. Every memory now carried a second meaning. The generous Christmas gifts, guilt. The times she praised me to relatives, performance. The way she always introduced me as my daughter who takes care of Harold, not pride, but branding, establishing the narrative, making it known that I was the caregiver so no one would question why the money went elsewhere. The workhorse doesn't own the farm. The workhorse works. That's what it does. That's all it does. It was around this time that I found the voicemail, the family iPad, an old one, 4th generation, that I'd kept charged by my father's bed for years so he could listen to audiobooks when I wasn't reading to him. After he died, I'd moved it to the kitchen counter in the cottage, used it occasionally for recipes. I picked it up one evening to look up a medication interaction for a patient at work. The cloud had synced, and there, in the voicemail backup, because my mother's iCloud account was still linked from years ago when she'd set it up, was a recording, 41 seconds long, dated 8 months before my father's death. My hands were shaking before I pressed play. My body already knew. My mother's voice, clear and unhurried, speaking to her financial advisor. Vivian doesn't need to know about the pension. She got to live rent-free, that's her share. She's the workhorse, not the owner. Brooke is the one who'll actually do something with the money. 41 seconds. By second 12, I had stopped breathing. The workhorse, not the owner. She said it casually, like she was describing a piece of equipment. Like 14 years of my life, my career, my fellowship, my 20s, my early 30s, were a service rendered by an appliance, the workhorse. Feed it, house it, keep it running. Don't pay it, don't acknowledge it, certainly don't give it ownership of anything. I played it again, and again, and again. Each time I heard something new, the absence of guilt in her tone, the warmth when she said Brooke's name, the dismissiveness when she said mine. This wasn't a difficult decision she'd agonized over. This was casual, settled, old news. She'd decided years ago who mattered and who was useful. I was useful. If you've ever been the one who stayed, the one who showed up every single day while everyone else built their lives, and then watched them divide up what you protected, you're not crazy. You're not selfish for wanting it acknowledged. Drop a comment if you've been the workhorse they forgot to thank. I need to know I'm not alone in this. After the voicemail, I knew the scope. What I didn't know yet was the full extent of my father's planning. That would come from his attorney. 3 months before that voicemail discovery, something had happened that I hadn't yet connected. Approximately 90 days after my father's death, his attorney, Martin Schultz, who'd handled his personal legal matters for decades, had mailed a sealed packet. Not to me, not to my mother, to the pension administrator and the IRS. My father had arranged this during a lucid period, 14 months before his death. He'd asked me to help him set up what he called the timer. I'd driven him to Martin's office, helped transfer him into the wheelchair, waited in the lobby while he spent 40 minutes inside. He never told me what it was. He said, "If everything goes the way it should, you'll never need to know." I didn't press him. I assumed it was something about the funeral arrangements. It wasn't about the funeral, it was about me. During that lucid window, my father had assembled a sealed packet containing his original beneficiary designations in his own handwriting, a handwritten letter documenting that I, Vivian, was his sole caregiver, and explicit instructions that if the designations were altered after his death, copies should be mailed to the pension administrator and the IRS. Martin Schultz held the packet with time delivery instructions. Mail 90 days after death. No exceptions, no delays, no contact with the family beforehand. The packet mailed itself. My father's failsafe fired while I was still in the fog of early grief, before I'd even called the pension office. By the time I discovered the beneficiary change, the pension administrator had already received my father's original documents and flagged the discrepancy. That's what the clerk had been referring to when she mentioned additional documentation from an attorney. My father had seen this coming. From his bed, from his wheelchair, unable to speak clearly, unable to sign his name without effort. He had seen exactly what my mother would do and built a mechanism to stop it. He protected me from beyond the grave because he knew I wouldn't protect myself. He knew I'd grieve and forgive and explain away. He knew me better than I knew myself. When I understood this, when Martin Schultz finally returned my call and confirmed what the packet contained, I sat on the floor of the cottage and cried for an hour. Not from sadness, from being known, from being loved by someone who saw the future clearly enough to build a wall around me before he left. But I still had work to do. The failsafe had triggered the official investigation, but it hadn't resolved anything yet, and I needed to understand everything before I acted. I needed the full architecture mapped. I needed it all. The masquerade began the week after I found the voicemail. I had the evidence. I had the scope. I had my father's failsafe working in the background. But I had to keep living as if I knew nothing. My mother was still my mother. She still called on Sundays. She still stopped by the cottage occasionally. She still performed the concerned parent role with practiced ease, and I had to perform the ignorant daughter. The first dinner was the hardest. She came to the cottage 3 days after I'd played that voicemail 17 times. She brought a bottle of wine and a rotisserie chicken from Whole Foods and said, "I thought you might like company." She sat at my kitchen table, 3 feet from the iPad that held her recorded voice calling me a workhorse, and told me about her book club's latest selection. She asked about work. She said I looked tired. She said, "You know, Vivi, you gave so much to your father. You deserve to rest now." I smiled. I nodded. I poured her wine. I said something about being grateful for the cottage. The chicken tasted like cardboard in my mouth. My jaw was clenched so tight I thought my molars might crack. Under the table, my left hand gripped my own thigh hard enough to leave a mark. She talked for an hour. She hugged me when she left. I smelled her perfume, the same one she'd worn when she visited my father once a month and told him he looked good. The same perfume that was on the scarf she wore to his funeral. The same perfume that would be in the air when I dismantled her entire performance in front of 14 people. I locked the door behind her and stood in the kitchen with both palms flat on the counter and breathed. 5 counts in, 5 counts out. The effort of not screaming was a physical weight distributed across my entire body. There were more masquerade moments. A phone call where she mentioned meeting with Gerald about the estate, and I said nothing about the fictitious salary she'd reported. A Sunday visit where she told me Brooke was doing so well in Charlotte, and I didn't say that I knew Brooke's husband was losing sleep over what he'd witnessed. A moment when she put her hand on my cheek and said, "Your father would be so proud of you, Vivi." And I did not flinch. I did not pull away. I did not tell her that my father had been proud enough to build a legal mechanism to protect me from her. The worst moment was the watch. 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, my mother invited me to lunch at a restaurant in Montclair. She was warm, attentive, present in a way she hadn't been in years. Over dessert, she pulled a small box from her purse and slid it across the table. Inside was my father's watch, a Seiko automatic he'd worn every day of his working life until his wrists became too thin to hold it. "I want you to have this," she said. Her eyes were wet. "He would have wanted you to have it." She handed me my father's watch and smiled. That smile cost me the cottage. Because that same afternoon, she filed the listing paperwork with a realtor to put the property on the market. I know this because Mitchell told me 3 days later. Mitchell, who wasn't supposed to be telling me anything. The watch sits on my wrist now. It sits there not as a gift from my mother, but as evidence of her methodology. Give something emotional. Create a moment of warmth and connection. Then execute the financial move while the target is softened by sentiment. She gave me the watch to make the eviction feel like a separate, unrelated event. She gave me the watch so that when I complained about losing the cottage, she could say, "But I gave her his watch. I tried to be generous." I wore it every day of the masquerade. I wore it and felt its weight as a reminder that the woman smiling at me across dinner tables had calculated my life down to the dollar and found me worth exactly nothing beyond what I could produce. Mitchell arrived at the cottage on a Tuesday evening. I hadn't expected him. He drove up in his silver Lexus with the headlights cutting through November darkness and knocked on my door at 7:45. He stood on the step holding a USB drive in his right hand, his left hand pushed through his hair in the way people do when they haven't slept properly in weeks. "I can't sleep anymore," he said. He came in. He sat at my kitchen table. The same seat my mother had occupied when she brought wine and lies. He told me what he'd heard. Brooke and my mother on speakerphone, discussing what to tell Gerald Byrne about the estate paperwork. His mother-in-law coaching his wife on which numbers to use, which explanations to offer, how to characterize my caregiver salary in terms that would survive an audit. He wasn't supposed to be home. He'd come back early from a client meeting. He stood in the hallway and listened to his wife being trained to lie by her mother, and he couldn't unknow it. The USB drive contained backed-up voicemails and text threads. Brooke's phone backed up to their shared cloud. Mitchell had copied the relevant files, messages between Brooke and my mother discussing the pension transfer, the TD bank account, the property listing timeline. There were text messages where my mother wrote, "Don't mention the pension to V. She'll make it about her." There was a thread where Brooke asked, "But doesn't Viv get anything?" And my mother responded, "She got free housing for 14 years. That is her share." I read every message that night. Mitchell sat with me. We didn't talk much. When I finished, I looked at him and said, "Why now?" He said, "Because they're going to lie to an accountant. Because it's fraud. Because I have a daughter and I don't want her growing up watching her mother learn this." He paused. "And because what they did to you is wrong. It's just wrong." 3 months later, I'd understand why Mitchell couldn't sleep. That Tuesday, I thought he was just being kind. He was kind. But he was also afraid. Afraid of what his marriage was built on. Afraid of who his wife was becoming under her mother's influence. That fear was its own engine. I asked Mitchell not to tell Brooke. He said Brooke had already noticed the iPad was missing from the kitchen counter and had asked me about it directly. I'd told her I moved it to the bedroom for audiobooks, which was technically true. He said he'd stay quiet. He said, "Just, whatever you're going to do it where everyone can hear. Don't let them handle it privately. They'll lie in private. They can't lie if everyone's listening." He was right. He was absolutely right. The evidence file was complete by mid-November. I laid it out on the cottage kitchen table. Every document, every photograph, every screenshot, every recording. The original beneficiary designation in my father's handwriting. The forged designation filed after his death. TD bank statements showing 47 deposits totaling $220,000. Gerald Byrne's records showing a caregiver salary I never received. Medical records showing my mother claiming a $1,400 monthly tax credit for care she never provided. The voicemail transcript. Mitchell's text thread screenshots. The pension office's formal inquiry letter. My father's sealed packet contents, confirmed by Martin Schultz. And the green spiral notebook. $67,000 of my own money, every entry dated, every receipt preserved, every dollar documented. I looked at all of it spread across the table and felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, not anger, grief. A different kind of grief. Not for my father, for the family I'd believed in, for the mother I'd thought I had, for the reality that 14 years of my sacrifice had been viewed, by the person who benefited most from it, as the natural output of an appliance, a workhorse. Working because that's what it does, not because it's loved, not because it matters, because it's useful. I photographed the complete spread. Then I organized it into a folder, chronological, labeled, notarized where relevant. Martin Schultz helped me prepare the formal documents. The pension office's inquiry letter was the keystone. Official, institutional, undeniable. It confirmed that the beneficiary change was under active investigation. It was addressed to my mother. She hadn't received it yet. I'd had Martin request they delay mailing to her until after a specific date. He told me that was unusual. I told him I needed her to hear it from me first. He looked at me for a long moment and said, "Your father would understand." Thanksgiving was 12 days away. Aunt Delia and Uncle Ray were flying in from Pittsburgh. My mother's brother Carl was coming from Hartford with his wife. Brooke and Mitchell were driving up from Charlotte. 14 family members total would be at the table. My mother had organized the dinner. She'd sent a group text saying, "Let's honor Harold's memory by being together." She was hosting at the main house. I was invited, of course. The workhorse was always invited to the family table. Workhorses need to eat. The ticking clock was the pension office's 120-day review window. The formal letter to my mother would mail automatically on December 3rd if I didn't act first. I had until Thanksgiving to control the revelation. After that, it would come piecemeal. A letter here, a phone call there, and my mother would have time to spin it. Time to reach people individually. Time to tell her version first. Mitchell's advice echoed. They can't lie if everyone's listening. 3 days before Thanksgiving, my mother came to the cottage one more time. She was in excellent spirits. She talked about the table settings, the menu, which wine to serve. She touched my shoulder as she left and said, "I'm so glad we'll all be together, Vivi. It's what your father would have wanted." I watched her walk back to the main house in the fading November light, her silhouette sharp against the white clapboard, and I felt the last tremor of doubt pass through me like a fever breaking. She had invoked my father's wishes. She had used his name, the man she'd robbed, the man she'd erased from his own financial legacy. She stood in the doorway of his home, the home she was about to sell out from under me, and told me he'd want us together. Yes, he would. He'd want us together. He'd want every single person in that room to hear what she'd done. The morning of Thanksgiving, I dressed carefully. Black slacks, a gray cashmere sweater my father had given me years ago, his watch on my wrist. I put the evidence folder in a leather tote bag. Inside the folder, the notarized letter from Martin Schultz containing my father's original documents, the voicemail transcript printed on legal paper, and the pension office inquiry letter in its official envelope. I checked 3 times that everything was there. My hands were steady. My breathing was even. I'd practiced this. In the mirror, in the shower, while driving. I'd rehearsed the sequence until it was procedural. Not emotional. Not revenge. Procedure. The main house smelled like turkey and sage and the particular warmth of too many bodies in a room with a working fireplace. Aunt Delia hugged me at the door. She'd always been affectionate with me, always praised my devotion to my father. Uncle Ray shook my hand and said I looked well. My cousin Jason and his wife were there with their 2 boys. Carl from Hartford. Brooke and Mitchell arrived 40 minutes before dinner. Brooke in a cream-colored dress, Mitchell in a navy blazer with dark circles under his eyes that no one else seemed to notice. My mother presided. She'd done her hair. She wore pearls. My father had given them to her for their 25th anniversary. She was radiant, composed, in control. We sat, 14 people around the extended dining table, the one my father had built from reclaimed oak when I was 12. The breadbasket made its rounds. Wine was poured. Conversation layered. Politics, real estate, someone's knee surgery, the boys' school play. Normal. Warm. The performance of family. My mother stood. She held her wine glass and smiled at the table with the particular glow of someone who believes they have gotten away with everything. "I want to make a toast," she said. "This year has been... God, it's been hard. Losing Harold. But I look around this table and I see what he left behind. This family. Each other. Sticking together. That's what matters. That's what he'd want." She raised her glass. People lifted theirs. I did not lift mine. The toast landed. People drank. My mother sat. Conversation resumed. I let 30 seconds pass. Then I reached into the tote bag at my feet and withdrew the folder. I placed it on the table between the cranberry sauce and the breadbasket. The sound it made, the flat, authoritative thud of legal paper on wood, cut through the ambient noise. Not everyone noticed immediately, but enough did. Aunt Delia looked at the folder, then at me. Brooke's glass paused at her lips. My mother's smile stayed in place, but her eyes dropped to the folder and something shifted behind them. A faint tightening, a microscopic recalculation. "Vivian?" she said, still smiling, still performing. "What's that, sweetheart?" I opened the folder. My voice was level. I had practiced this level. "This is a notarized letter from Martin Schultz, Dad's personal attorney. It contains Dad's original beneficiary designation for his pension survivor benefits, in his own handwriting, dated 3 years before his death. It names me, Vivian, as sole beneficiary." The table was quiet. Forks had stopped moving. I looked at my mother's face. The smile was still there, but it had frozen. A muscle memory without a mind behind it. 3 days after Dad's funeral, I continued, a new beneficiary designation was filed with the pension office. It changed the benefit from my name to a joint designation for you and Brooke. It was signed with Dad's name. I paused. Let that sit. Dad had been dead for 3 days when that form was signed. My mother's wine glass was halfway between the table and her lips. It stopped there and did not move. 11 seconds. I counted them. "That's not—" my mother started. "That's a misunderstanding. The pension office made an error. Harold told me he wanted—" "Harold couldn't speak in the weeks before he died," I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. His last verbal communication of any kind was 6 days before his passing. I was present for it. His nurse documented it. He could not have told you anything about beneficiary designations in the timeline you're describing. She shifted. The glass lowered. I saw her eyes move. To Brooke. To Aunt Delia. Back to me. Measuring the room. Calculating her next defense. "Well, he told me earlier. Months before. He wanted the family taken care of." I pulled the second document from the folder. The pension office's formal inquiry letter. This is from the New Jersey Division of Pensions. It confirms that the beneficiary change filed after Dad's death is under active investigation for suspected forgery. They received Dad's original documents through his attorney 90 days after his passing. Dad arranged that himself. The pension office has flagged a signature discrepancy. They have not yet mailed this letter to you, but they will on December 3rd. The room was absolutely silent. Aunt Delia set her fork down. She didn't pick it up again for the rest of the meal. Uncle Ray's jaw was working slowly, processing. Brooke had gone pale. Not guilty pale, confused pale. She didn't know everything. She knew some things, but not this. "This is absurd," my mother said. Her voice had found its footing. Sharp now, affronted. "I am his wife. I have every right to manage his estate as I see fit. A grieving widow. You also," I said, pulling the next sheet, "reported to the family accountant that you had been paying me a caregiver salary for the past 4 years. Gerald Byrne confirmed this to me directly. He had records of deductions. I never received a salary, not $1. In 14 years of full-time caregiving, I was never paid anything by anyone in this family." I looked at her. "Would you like to explain to this table why you told our accountant I was being compensated?" Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. It was meant to cover the cottage. Rent equivalent. You lived here for free, Vivian. That has value. "I lived here," I said quietly, "because someone needed to be within earshot of Dad's monitor at 3 in the morning, because someone needed to administer his medications every 4 hours, because someone needed to turn him every 2 hours to prevent pressure sores. I spent $67,000 of my own money on his care. I have every expense documented." I placed the green spiral notebook on the table. Its cover was worn soft from years of handling, the spiral bent from being shoved into bags and coat pockets on the way to pharmacies and medical supply stores. "This notebook has 14 years of receipts. Do you have 14 years of receipts for the salary you claim you paid me?" Her face was changing. The performance was failing. I could see the machinery behind it, the calculation, the attempt to find the next narrative, the next defense that might hold. She looked at Brooke, and what she found in Brooke's face was not alliance. It was shock. "Brooke," she said, Tell them what Dad wanted." "Mom," Brooke said. Her voice was thin. What is the pension thing? You told me Dad changed it himself." "He did," my mother said quickly. "He did. Before he didn't," I said. I pulled the voicemail transcript from the folder. My hands were perfectly steady. "This is a transcript of a voicemail you left for Richard Keene, your financial advisor, 8 months before Dad died." I read aloud. "Vivian doesn't need to know about the pension. She got to live rent-free. That's her share. She's the workhorse, not the owner. Brooke is the one who will actually do something with the money." I said the words clearly. I said them at a conversational volume. I let them land in the silence of that room, at that table, in front of 14 people who had just toasted to family sticking together. My mother's face did something I'd never seen it do. The mask, the careful, composed, pleasant mask she'd worn for as long as I could remember, cracked. Not gracefully, not like someone accepting they'd been caught. Like something breaking under pressure it wasn't built to withstand. Her lips pulled back. Her nostrils flared. For one terrible second she looked at me with an expression that was pure fury. Rage at being exposed, not remorse for what she'd done. "You went through my things," she whispered. "You ungrateful." "I also have the tax records," I continued, not reacting to the shift. "Procedure, not emotion. You filed as primary caregiver on Dad's insurance documents to claim a $1,400 monthly tax credit for 14 years. Care you did not provide. The IRS has been notified through Dad's attorney. They will be requesting documentation from you." Aunt Delia stood up. Not dramatically, just stood, as if her body couldn't remain seated. She looked at my mother with an expression I recognized from working with patients' families. The look of someone revising everything they know about a person in real time. "Lorraine," Aunt Delia said. My mother's name sounded different in that room now, stripped of the warmth it usually carried. "Is this true? The pension? The tax credit? Is this true?" "It's... Delia, you don't understand the full picture. Harold was very clear with me that he wanted... Harold built the failsafe," I said. 14 months before he died, during a lucid period, he went to his attorney and prepared sealed documents to be mailed if anyone changed his beneficiary designations. He knew this would happen. He knew, and he planned for it because he couldn't stop it while he was alive. His body was failing, but his mind was clear enough to see what you were building. My mother's hand was gripping the edge of the table. Her knuckles were white. She looked at Brooke again, still looking for alliance, still looking for the daughter she'd groomed to stand beside her. But Brooke was staring at the table surface. Mitchell's hand was on Brooke's shoulder. He was not surprised. He had known. "Vivian doesn't need to know," I repeated. "She's the workhorse, not the owner." I looked at my mother directly. "I heard your voice say those words. I have the recording. 14 people in this room now know that's how you describe the daughter who gave up her career, her fellowship, her 20s, to keep your husband alive while you traveled. While you took cruises. While you told your book club I had a spending problem." Patrice's name hung in the air without being spoken. Everyone in that room knew my mother's social world. Everyone could calculate the radius of her narrative. My mother's chin lifted. One final defense. The hardest one to watch. Her eyes filled with tears. Her voice trembled. "I am a grieving widow," she said. "And my daughter is attacking me at Thanksgiving in front of my family. Harold would be ashamed. Harold built the evidence packet that's currently being reviewed by the pension administrator," I said. "Harold documented everything. Harold saw this coming. Harold would not be ashamed of me." I closed the folder. I placed both hands flat on the table. I looked at my mother one more time and said the thing I'd rehearsed last. The thing I almost hadn't included. The thing that was for me, not for the room. I was enough for him. He wrote it in this notebook. In shaking handwriting, the last entry he ever made. V, you were enough. I was enough for him. I am asking you nothing. I am telling you what I know, what the pension office knows, and what the IRS knows. What happens next is not my decision. It's theirs. I stood. I picked up the folder and the green notebook. Mitchell stood too. Brooke didn't move. My mother didn't move. Aunt Delia was crying, quiet tears tracking down her face. Uncle Ray's hand was over his mouth. The table was silent except for the faint sound of one of Jason's boys asking, from the living room, if dinner was over. I walked out of the dining room, down the hallway, through the kitchen, out the back door, across the yard, and into the cottage. I locked the door. I set the folder on the kitchen counter. I sat in my father's recliner, and I cried. Not from pain, from release. The weight of carrying someone else's secrets in my own body for months. The masquerade, the smiling, the performing ignorance, was finally off me. My shoulders actually dropped, physically lowered. I felt the muscles release one at a time, like cables being cut. What followed took 5 months, but it moved with the momentum of institutional machinery. The pension administrator reversed the fraudulent beneficiary change. My father's original designation was restored. I was named sole survivor beneficiary. The back disbursements that had gone to the joint account were flagged for recovery. The formal investigation into the forged signature proceeded through channels I wasn't privy to, but Martin Schultz kept me informed. The IRS sent my mother a letter requesting documentation for 4 years of caregiver tax credits, $1,400 monthly for 48 months. She could not provide documentation because there was no documentation. You cannot document a salary that was never paid. You cannot prove caregiving that was never performed. Gerald Byrne, the accountant, formally severed his professional relationship with her after his own counsel advised him of potential liability. Brooke stopped returning our mother's calls. I learned this from Mitchell, who continued to check in with me every few weeks. It wasn't immediate. Brooke resisted the truth the way I had resisted it at first, with alternative explanations and diminishing denials. But the voicemail was 41 seconds of my mother's undisguised voice. You cannot explain that away. You cannot reframe, she's the workhorse, not the owner, into something loving. Brooke listened to it. Mitchell said she played it 3 times, then set the phone down and didn't speak for an hour. Then she called their attorney. My mother tried to control the narrative. Of course she did. She called Aunt Delia the day after Thanksgiving and offered her side of the story. She called Carl. She called Jason's wife. But she was working against the voicemail transcript, against the pension office investigation, against institutional documentation that contradicted everything she said. She told Aunt Delia that I'd manipulated the documents. Aunt Delia asked her to explain the forged signature. She couldn't. She told Carl that the voicemail was taken out of context. Carl asked her what context makes she's the workhorse, not the owner, acceptable. She couldn't answer. Within 2 months, Aunt Delia organized a family gathering, Easter weekend in Pittsburgh, and did not invite my mother. The exclusion was quiet but total. The family had recalibrated. Not because I'd asked them to, not because I'd campaigned or lobbied or pleaded my case individually, because institutional evidence speaks for itself, because a pension office investigation and an IRS inquiry are not family gossip, they're facts. Because 14 people heard a 41-second voicemail and understood exactly what my mother thought of the daughter who kept her husband alive. Patrice shared what she'd witnessed. Not the Thanksgiving confrontation, but the grocery store conversation. She told the book club. She told the church circle. Not dramatically, not vindictively, just honestly. She told them that Vivian Pemberton didn't have a spending problem. that Vivian's mother had told her otherwise, and she let the group do the math. By March, my mother was living in a rental apartment in Edison. The Montclair house listing was pulled. My attorney had filed a lien against the property pending resolution of the estate and pension disputes. She was alone. Not dramatically alone, not tragically alone, just alone the way people end up alone when they've exhausted every relationship's capacity for trust. Uninvited, uncontacted, not hated, just no longer believed. The cottage was quiet. It had always been quiet. 11 years of watching over my father, the silence of a sick room, the hum of medical equipment, the murmur of audiobooks playing on a fourth-generation iPad. But this quiet was different. This was the quiet of a space that belonged to me now, not as a concession, not as payment for services rendered, but as mine because my father named it mine, and no forged document could undo that. The watch on my wrist ticked with a sound I could only hear at night, lying in bed, in the gap between one thought and the next. My father's watch, given to me by my mother as a manipulation tool, kept by me as the only authentic thing about that lunch, because it was his, regardless of who handed it to me. It counted seconds the way he would have, steadily and without complaint. On a Sunday in March, I sat in his recliner in the cottage. The green spiral notebook was in my lap. I hadn't opened it since Thanksgiving. I turned pages slowly. 14 years of entries, medication costs from 2011, a wheelchair ramp installation in 2014, BiPAP machine supplies, 2017, hospice bed rental, 2022, $67,000 of devotion documented in blue ballpoint pen. I turned to the last entry, dated the week he entered hospice. Not my handwriting, his, shaking, barely legible. The letters formed with the total concentration of a body that had almost nothing left to give. V, you were enough. 4 words, his handwriting. The last thing he ever wrote in this notebook. The notebook I'd thought was just an expense log, just a record of money spent. But he'd used the last page for something else entirely. Not an expense, not a receipt, a message, the only one that mattered. I closed the notebook. I set it on the shelf beside his reading glasses. The wire-rimmed ones he'd stopped being able to wear years before he died, but that I'd kept because they still held the shape of his face. The notebook and the glasses together on the shelf. Evidence and tenderness. The record of what I gave and the proof that it was seen. The grief was still there. It would always be there. Not just for him, but for the family I'd believed in. For the mother I'd thought was merely imperfect, rather than calculated. But it had changed shape. It was softer now, lighter. Something I could carry instead of something that carried me. I used to believe that loyalty would be recognized by the people who received it. I was wrong. Loyalty is recognized by the people who possess it. The others, the ones who receive it without returning it, they don't see loyalty. They see utility. They see a resource. They see a workhorse. The distinction between being loved and being useful is the most important distinction a person can learn, and some of us learn it too late, and some of us learn it at exactly the right time. If this story made you sit up straighter, if it made you think about something you've been carrying that other people refuse to weigh, I hear you. I was in that chair for 14 years before I learned that the weight was mine to set down, not theirs to acknowledge. According to the National Academy of Elder Law Attorneys, over 70% of family caregivers report receiving no financial compensation for their labor. And the AARP estimates that family caregivers in the United States provide an average of 24 hours per week of unpaid care. Care that, if purchased, would cost over $470 billion annually. This story has been told. One green notebook. One 41-second voicemail. One notarized letter placed between the cranberry sauce and the breadbasket. If you've ever been the one who stayed while others left, The one who gave without counting until the counting was all you had left. Leave a comment below. Tell me your number. Tell me your years. I'll be here, reading every single one. Subscribe if you want to hear what happens when workhorses learn to own their own fields. Until next time.